This week, we talk about how to improve your street photography by removing distracting elements from your composition. Hi, everybody. This is Ibarionex from the Candid Frame. Welcome back. One of the things I want to talk about in this video is how to remove distractions from your compositions, especially elements that may be on the background or at the edges of the frame. Because we shoot on the street often, there are any number of distractions, either people, signage, cars, a whole variety of different things that can ruin the impact and the effectiveness of a photograph. Um, those distracting elements can be eliminated in any variety of ways, most of which involves you changing your camera position to change the relationship between you, the subject, and the background. And another is using shadow and highlight, especially the shadow, to obscure certain details that you don't think contribute to the overall shot. So that's what we're going to discuss here. But before we do, if you're interested in submitting images to the Candid Frame Flickr pool, from which I pull from to do these weekly, critique sessions, you can do so by going to Flickr and doing a search on the Candid Frame. You'll find the URL right here. And all you need to do is ask to be added to the group, and I'll be glad to do so. But make sure you do it on your computer rather than your phone or your tablet. If you do it on your phone or tablet, you'll get a message telling you that it's a private group and it's invitation only. Disregard that. Just go to your computer, ask to be added, and I'll be glad to do that. But for now, let's jump back into the images. This is a shot by Tuarissa. This was created with the Olympus EM10 Mark III at 1/400th of a second, f14, ISO 200. Now, this image illustrates one of the ways in which I just described, in which you can obscure distractions in the background. And that is by finding a high contrast scene and exposing for the highlights and letting the shadows go dark or go completely black. When you find a high contrast scene like this and you expose for the highlights, and you can expose for the highlights by either using the camera in manual exposure mode and setting the exposure that way, or if you're using an automatic exposure mode like aperture priority, applying some negative exposure compensation like minus 2/3 of a stop or minus a stop. And what happens when you do that is the area that's being illuminated by the sun, in this case, becomes the dominant element in the frame. All the color, the texture, the lines of the tarp in the background and the wood frame behind it become really cleanly defined. And because the other areas of the frame are rendered into shadow, you don't see any details there that hold our attention. It all becomes about not only the red tarp, but the young woman who passes in front of the scene to help complete the composition. And you'll see this technique practiced by a lot of photographers who not only contribute to the Candid Frame Flickr poll, but also on Instagram. Using high contrast light in this way is a regular practice among all street photographers, whether they're young and new to it or have been shooting this way for years. And one of the ways that I like using shadow is to obscure details that I don't think are important, that I find distracting. And had this scene been more evenly lit, either by direct sunlight or if it was open shade, that would have meant that everything else that was in this frame would have had a potential for drawing our attention here. And this woman certainly wouldn't have been rendered in silhouette. Because the shot is not so much about her as it is the shape of her, the line of her nose, her lips, her chin, her neck, as defined by the contrast that's created by that saturated red tarp behind her. This is not a portrait of this woman. This is not even a candid portrait of this woman. This is more about color, line, and shape. That's what's at the heart of this image and what makes it effective. And you can see that the lines created by the shadow themselves on the left-hand corner of the frame and at the bottom of the frame and even towards the right edge of the frame really add to the shot, even though those very shadows are obscuring certain details in the scene, including some of the finer details of her hair, her eyes, her face, her clothing from the composition. By simplifying the composition in this way, it makes it a more effective shot. Sometimes people think that more is better and that having a lot of stuff in your composition makes for a better shot. But more often than not, at least to my thinking, if you're not in control of all those elements within the frame in terms of your conscious choice to include them or exclude them from the frame, those things can get out of control and reduce the impact of your shot because there are things in that frame that you didn't recognize when you were making the shot. And I think that the photographer here was in really good control over the framing, the placement of the woman in the frame, and resulted in a really good and interesting shot. Okay, here we have a shot by Sergei Chervakov. This was created with a Ricoh at 1/800th of a second, f8, ISO 640. Now, this is a shot that I've made many times before when I've used a crosswalk and the street itself as the background. There are certain locations in Los Angeles, New York, different places where I've traveled where the crosswalks themselves are really an interesting graphic. You can see here that the repetition of the yellow, white, and black lines that go from the bottom of the frame all the way to the top, and the lines on the street and the shadow on the street itself really provide a really interesting backdrop for this man here who was waiting at the crosswalk about to cross the street. It's a very graphic shot like the one before, but here we're not dealing with light and shadow here as we are the relative position of the camera. Because normally when you're standing at a crosswalk waiting across the street and you're looking across the street, your camera is going to be parallel to your eye view, and that would include the other people at the other end of the street who are going to walk in the opposite way, the buildings, the cars. And what Sergei does really well here is by raising the camera up slightly and tilting it down, he eliminates all those distracting elements in the background. So they play no part at all in this composition. And it also helps to define this man's head and his hand by framing them at the top of those repeating lines. You don't see his head being cut off at the top of the frame, and that's a result of the change in camera angle, which is really critical to making this shot work. Now his coat, this massive black, is kind of analogous to the shadow in the previous shot, but here it really is a draw. Normally we're drawn to the brightest element in the frame, but here it's this almost inky blackness that dominates a good, third of the frame that makes the shot really great. It's the contrast between that coat and those repeating lines in the background, which culminates in this wonderful gesture of him raising his hand to scratch his head. Without the gesture, I don't think the shot would have been as effective. It would have just been some guy about to cross the street. So the gesture is really important, but again, it's the exclusion of all those other potential elements, cars, different people, signage, that could have really diminished the impact of the shot. And one of the things I always suggest to my students is scan the edges of your frame. Go from 12, 3, 6, 9 o'clock and back to 12 to make sure that any elements at the periphery of the frame are meant to be there, that they complement your subject in some way. And if they don't, you got to get rid of it. So you either got to move further in, further out, change your focal length, change your camera position, do whatever you have to do within the few seconds that you have to make the shot in order to make it as effective as possible. Yeah, you can crop after the fact, but that's not a way of really practicing and developing your own eye for composition and making a really effective photograph. Okay, here we have a shot by Kostas Katsouris. This was created with a Fujifilm X-T10 at 1/25th of a second, f3.2, ISO 200. Now, this is a really lovely shot. The shot stopped me cold because I just really enjoyed the way the shot made me feel. And this woman is holding a bunch of balloons that are positioned in front of her face. And the balloons themselves, even though they are a foreground element, obscure a bunch of distractions that are in the background. You can see that this is a street scene. You can see the facade of a store or a business on the upper left-hand corner of the frame. You see about 3 people standing on the sidewalk. You see some things in the bottom right-hand of the frame. But most of the setting, wherever this location is completely obscured by the presence of these balloons that are in front of this woman. And the balloons are a great way of removing a bunch of different distractions so that all we focus on is the balloons and that woman's red lips and the smile that crosses her face. The shot is shot under very diffuse light. So this is like an overcast day or partly cloudy day. So we don't have the strong contrast of the first shot, which can make creating simplified compositions a challenge. But here, the photographer uses the balloons themselves by physically just moving in and framing the shot in the way that he does. Now, some people will complain that her face is not tack sharp. Instead, it's one of the ribbons or some of the ribbons in the foreground is where focus was detected. So her mouth and her chin and her clothes are out of focus. But for me, that doesn't matter because I like how the shot makes me feel. It's not technically perfect. I admit that, but I still love the moment that was captured. There's something to be said for capturing a genuine moment that's less than perfect than a perfect shot that doesn't make me feel anything. And I see a lot of shots that are technically perfect, but I don't feel anything. And that's not the case with this shot. I'm sure that the photographer would have loved to have had the lips sharp, but I have shots of my own where they're slightly out of focus, and I'm kind of bummed that I didn't nail the focus, but the shot, I love the shot so much, I go, I'm including it in my portfolio. I include it on my website. I'll share it on Instagram because it's the moment that trumps all else. And this is a real simple shot, not just in terms of what's obscured by the balloons, but just look at the color palette. We've got a lot of blues, largely because of the quality of the light and the color temperature at which it was shot, but also just the blue of the ribbons that are secured to the balloons and the contrast that creates with her warm skin and those red lips and that great smile. It's a wonderful shot, and I love how the photographer used an element that normally wouldn't be considered as so important to a composition in this way, as this shot ends up proving that it is. Because sometimes the balloons themselves would become the subject of a shot, but here it's just used as a graphic element and a tool to obscure distractions in the background and to bring our attention to the heart of the image, which is this woman's smile, which is great. All right, I hope you found that helpful and fun, and I hope it inspires you the next time you go out to photograph. And if you want to find out more about the Candid Frame, all you have to do is go to thecandidframe.com, and it's where I host my podcast, which I've been doing for the last 13 and a half years, where I feature conversations with photographers of all genres. And my latest conversation was with Diana Lundeen. She is a pet portrait photographer, a commercial pet portrait photographer, and she's going to be coming out with a book in the near future called Dogs versus Ice Cream. And if you think the title is great, you wait till you see the images. I mean, they're just wonderful. But she also has a great story to tell. So you can go to thecandidframe.com and you can stream it there, or you can download it wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you like what you're seeing here on these videos on this YouTube channel, give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and see you next time.